Okay, so we've seen a few different types of exception, and in fact, Python has around 60 of these things built in. Um, so we've seen memory errors, we've seen attribute errors. We also saw file not found, although we didn't actually type that into our code. That was just something that came out. So the kind of common ones, the more common ones that you might come across include things like import error. So if you know, at the top of the program, you're importing stuff. So if you built a program on your computer and gave it to somebody else, um, and they didn't have that module on their computer, so maybe tkinter, that's pretty common, but maybe some of the less common modules, if they try to use that program, they'd get an error. Even though it worked fine on your computer, it wouldn't work on theirs because they don't have that module, they can't import that module. So then you'll get an import error. That's quite common. Value error can occur when you're trying to convert a string to a number. So we've done this a number of times. If you ask the user for a number and they then convert it, you can use int or float to convert it. But if it's not possible to convert it, so say the user's given you 6.5 and you try and convert that to an integer, you'll get a value error. And again, you can handle that and tell the user, you need to give me an integer. File not found, we've seen that. You try to open a file that doesn't exist. Name error can occur if a variable hasn't been defined. So if you try and use a variable that hasn't been defined, that would normally be something you would encounter as a programmer, and normally something that PyCharm would warn you about. Assuming you're using PyCharm, it would tell you before you even tried to run the program that there was a problem with something. Okay, we can even create our own exceptions. Now, as an example, I've got a simple sort of standalone example. Suppose we want the user to enter a non-negative integer. So the way we'd normally do this, we ask the user for a string. So if we use the input function to get some input into the program, so we haven't got a GUI here. We're just asking the user for a string. We're going to convert that into a number. And if it can't be converted into a number, Python would raise a value error. So for example, if they type in 1.5, we're asking for an integer, they type in 1.5, we'll get a value error, and we can handle that and tell the user they need to input an integer. But we can also, suppose we're asking for a non-negative integer, as we might do it, you can imagine in the pizza program, we might ask how many pizzas do you want, or so we would need that to be a whole number, a non-negative integer, because you can't have 2.5 pizzas unless you've eaten half of one. You can't order them anyway, and you can't have -1 pizzas. So what we can do is we can raise an exception, our own exception, if it's negative. And the example will demonstrate this by what it does is repeatedly ask the user for non-negative integers and adds them all up. Let me just demonstrate it first. So add non-negative, here it is. So if I run, I won't show you the code to start with, let me just run it. In the output window, it says, please enter a non-negative integer, and it's just going to add these numbers up. So if I put in 1, 2, 3, and if I put in nothing, it will then add up the numbers that I've given it. So 1, 2, and 3 add up to 6. But if I run that again, if the user puts in something that isn't an integer, 1.5, it says, sorry, I said an integer. And if they put in something that's maybe an integer but isn't positive, so -1, then it'll say, sorry, I said non-negative. So it's quite a helpful program in terms of asking the user for what it wants. Okay, so the code to do that is here, as we saw just now. And you can see, first of all, it asks the user for their input, as we've seen. And if the string, if they enter nothing, then it'll break out of that loop. So this is an input loop here. It'll break out of that loop and print out the total. Okay. Once they've typed, assuming they have typed something in, it'll try and convert that into a string. And if the user has typed in something that can't be converted to an integer, so it can't use this int function to convert it, then that will raise a value error, and the execution will drop down to here, and it will say, sorry, I said an integer. If, however, the number is less than 0, so it is an integer, but the number is less than 0, then we can raise our own exception here. So I said here we're raising an exception with the text, sorry, I said non-negative, and that's caught by this except statement. So except it's just catching any exception as error, and it prints out whatever that exception is. So this error is the exception that's been raised, and it prints it out, which in this case is just going to be, sorry, I said non-negative. So it raises, this is the term, raises an exception if the user enters a negative integer, and prints out a message if the input cannot be converted into an int. Any other exception, including the one we raised, is printed out there. So again, if it ran out of memory, that would be caught here. But I can't quite imagine how that would happen. And that's what it looks like when it runs, as you saw. If you put in something that can't be converted, so 1.0 or 1 as a word, it'll say, sorry, I said integer. If you put in something that's negative, an integer but negative, it says, sorry, I said non-negative. Okay, so what have we seen today? We've seen how to deal with CSV files, some sort of basic code for dealing with CSV files. As I said, there are modules inside Python and also available externally that will handle the CSV files in much more detail than that. We've seen how to deal with errors using this try except keywords in Python to catch errors. And then we've seen 3 different types of errors that are quite commonly occur. So file not found, memory error when the program runs out of memory, and attribute error as a sort of internal check that one of the objects is able to do what you want it to do. We've seen that actually there are 60 exceptions available in Python, but we can even create our own using this homemade exception code. So I hope you found that interesting, and I'll leave it here and see you next week for some inheritance. So we're talking, in the next lecture, we're talking much more about some of the object-oriented features of Python.